My name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Peter Drummey. Peter serves as the chief historian and Stephen T. Riley librarian at the Massachusetts Historical Society. During the program, Peter will be telling us about the very informative, engaging exhibition entitled "The Die is Cast: Interest in Ideals That Motivated the Boston Tea Party," which is on display until February 29th. We'll go on a behind-the-scenes tour and in the process come to better understand and appreciate some of the social, political, and historical context at the time of the Boston Tea Party through the lives and perspectives of 6 well-known individuals: Paul Revere, Joseph Warren, Phyllis Wheatley, Prince Hall, John Rowe, and Thomas Hutchinson. Let's start by meeting Peter and then hearing all about The Die is Cast. Welcome, Peter. So delighted you're able to be here again.
It's wonderful to be here, and I will enjoy talking to you about something that's very important to me.
Well, last week I had the wonderful opportunity to visit the Historical Society, tour the exhibit, learned a lot, eager to find out more and have you inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, would you just very briefly share a little bit about your background, professional interest, and current position?
Yes, I've worked at the Massachusetts Historical Society since 1978. I came here. I grew up on the South Shore near Boston, but lived and worked elsewhere and went to school in New York, but came back here not long after the bicentennial of the events we're talking about today. And for most of my career, I would have said, I'm interested in a more distant past, of the time of the Revolution or the colonial period, saying sort of glibly that after the invention of photography, everything is current events. But I have to say that the longer I'm here and the more interested I am in things that we don't have within our very large collection, the more interested I am in a more recent past, the beginning of the 20th century and the time of the First World War, where the whole world shifted in extraordinary ways.
And then just also briefly to inform viewers who might not be aware, just a little of the history and mission of the Historical Society.
The Massachusetts Historical Society was founded soon after the Revolution in 1791. At first, until it was incorporated, it was named simply the Historical Society because there were no others. They wouldn't have known what a mission statement was, but essentially they had one. They set out to collect and preserve and communicate, that is, publish or transmit information for a complete history of this country, that is, in the new nation. We're more narrowly focused in our mission on the history of Massachusetts, but our collection, especially for the colonial or national period, really is national in character.
Mm-hmm. And then moving to the present, why and how did the Die is Cast exhibition come about?
Well, I think that we were thinking about, essentially as a historical organization, what we would do to commemorate the events of leading up to the Revolution and the Boston Tea Party. And just as an aside, I should make clear that no one at the time was calling this the Boston Tea Party. They referred to it as the destruction of the tea, or depending on their outlook, often called it the destruction of the accursed tea. But in the 19th century, this term is applied to the Tea Party and becomes essentially how we know it. So that's an aside, but probably worth people might be surprised where they don't see any contemporary references to it as the Tea Party, but that's what we call it and what our exhibit and we use in our exhibition. But we were trying to figure where there are going to be reenactments, there's plays and programs at a number of Boston museums and historical and cultural institutions. We're primarily a repository collecting personal and family papers, so we thought we would build our exhibition out to commemorate this event out from our strength, but then bring into it, try to give some context to the Boston Tea Party. That is, to point out that this wasn't the central issue on some or many people's minds, and not everyone was in agreement about the resistance to the importation of tea.
You know, for those who haven't had the chance to visit yet, before we are fortunate to look at some wonderful artifacts, would you share briefly how the exhibit is laid out, and also why and how the 6 individuals that are features were chosen?
Well, the exhibition is perhaps will catch people by surprise. That is, we have a relatively small part of our exhibition, a sort of introductory room that focuses on the events of December 16th. That is, on the Tea Party itself. And then what we're trying to do is to take people who were living in Boston at the time, who were from different stations of life and ages and circumstances, some famous and important public figures, other relatively plain people, and show as much as we can how they were influenced by this event and how they influenced the event. That is, their roles in it, or where their own personal preoccupation was. So we're picking out people. You can't represent a population of, say, 15 or 16,000 and 6 individuals, but we're trying to make sure that there was a reasonable cross-section of people with in that sort of sample that we've selected.
Well, as we begin our tour, we're going to hear about each of the individuals. And the first one to share a little bit about is John Adams, and this incredible letter that we have in front of us that led to the title of the exhibition.
Yes, John Adams is not one of the 6 specific individuals we're focusing on, but he is sort of a commentator throughout our exhibition. He and Abigail Adams, his wife, are people who wrote to or received information from people in the exhibition. John Adams was a convinced patriot. He celebrated, as he does in this letter. And let me just, the first paragraph is very short, so let me just read this. This is what he writes to James Warren, and that can be a little complicated because one of our characters is a distant cousin, Joseph Warren, but he's writing to James Warren, a political leader in Massachusetts at the time, and he writes, "Dear sir, the die is cast. The people have passed the river and cut away the bridge. Last night, 3 cargoes of tea were emptied into the harbor. This is the grandest event which has happened since the controversy with Britain opened!" Exclamation mark. But
Wow.
That's a sort of succinct statement of, by not long after, retrospectively, but someone writing the next day and sort of seeing the importance of this event. And also, he doesn't directly say crossing the Rubicon, but it very much has that idea that I believe that he, just as he says, the die, and that's his wonderful spelling. This is the die you throw. I think he is thinking there's no way back from this point. And he turns out to be right. Paradoxically, the King of England, King George III, The next year, looking back at these events, he wrote in a speech, "The die is cast." His spelling was a little better, or corrected for him. But on both ends of the spectrum, people are coming to the same conclusion about the extraordinary importance of this event.
Well, I know there's much more we could say about the letter, but for the sake of time, we're going to move on
Sure.
to hear some of the different perspectives that you mentioned in your introductory remarks.
This is the last, even though chronologically this takes place, this is printed early in November of 1773, so several weeks before the Boston Tea Party. I think it's a kind of eloquent statement of people in between. That is, this is a protest not against the importation of tea, but against the resistance to the importation of tea. This is East India tea, which even it's taxed at a very low rate, and it undercuts the merchants who are dealing with tea in colonial Boston. So this is saying, don't be swept up in this resistance, that you're acting essentially as sort of you're being manipulated by the merchants of Boston, and that true patriots are people who would go along with this plan that the British government had to sort of essentially to bail out the British East India Company by sending tea to at least some part of this vast amount of tea they had to America, and taxing it at such a low rate that it would be extremely attractive to purchase, even though people here were had no stake or no say in that taxation.
You know, it's documents like these and some of the individuals you chose to highlight that give this balanced picture that I think a lot of us don't necessarily come to the event with, thinking that, oh, everybody wanted to throw the tea overboard and was protesting, but that was far from the case indeed.
This is extremely important, both to know that there's both this resistance to the resistance, and then it's not indifference, but other actors in our story are going to be much more concerned with other things in their lives than this debate over taxation, as important as it is.
In addition to documents, wonderful artifacts like this punch bowl of Benjamin Eads.
Yes, Benjamin Eads and his partner John Gill are patriot printers. They're people whose weekly newspaper, the Boston Gazette, espouses the patriot cause, is essentially documenting events unfolding in Boston, but also very much promoting resistance to the importation of tea. And this is a wonderful artifact. I think that it helps imply, we think of this tea, the East India Company bringing the tea here, but we don't think that this is tea. There's not tea grown in India yet. This is tea that's coming from China all the way around the world by way of the Indian Ocean and around Africa to England, and then exported to America, the American colonies, North American colonies. And it's not just tea, it's all these wonderful things that have both been introduced into the Western world. Tea, which had been medicinal and used in limited quantities, a sort of high culture good, had become, with this massive importation, a kind of necessity of everyday life. And all the accoutrements that came along, silk and China, that is China ware, coming from there. It is called the Eads tea bowl because Benjamin Eads had a teenage son named Peter who recollected much later, almost 70 years later, how he remembered the night of the Boston Tea Party. He wasn't allowed to drink strong punch from this a bowl, this punch to afford it for the people who are going to break into the holds of the ships and destroy the tea. He wasn't allowed to drink from it, but he was allowed to make the punch himself. And he remembered this about, here is his father is newspaper publisher giving weekly accounts of what's happening. In fact, the weekly accounts weren't enough, was actually publishing separately ongoing accounts of the events leading up to it, but willing to take a part with his friends and allies in the a more direct action than merely protest. Is, according to his son, a participant. But it's wonderful to think of this battered object passed down from generations of the Eads family with this connection to this epical event, as John Adams would have it.
Most definitely. And speaking of tea, fortunate to have this sample.
Yes, one of the early members of the Historical Society, Thaddeus Mason Harris, the Reverend Thaddeus Mason Harris, was he was only about 5 when the Tea Party took place, but he grew up, went to college, and became a Unitarian minister. And he was the minister for most of his life of the First Church of Dorchester. This is when Dorchester was a separate town across the harbor from Boston. And I think in his capacity as the town minister, he was given or acquired these sort of relics, these sort of tea scooped up from the harbor. And it's not tea that was wet, taken out of the water. Accounts of the Tea Party, they broke into the ships, open the chests, threw all this enormous amount of tea into the harbor. So someone describes the next day, and is looking out onto the harbor. It looked like a field that had been mown. Mm-hmm. That is, it was covered with a thick layer of tea floating on it. Some of it floated over to Dorchester across the harbor and was scooped up there. Now, the Sons of Liberty very much wanted all the tea to be destroyed. In fact, they sent members over to Dorchester to try to keep people from essentially salvaging this tea. And some of it was either kept hidden or kept away. And Harris later on was an active member of the Historical Society and our librarian. So he understood this to be tea saved, and wrote a little inscription on the bottle saying it was tea that was gathered on Dorchester Neck the next day. And he kept this his whole life and gave this to the Historical Society in the 1840s. And how do I know it's real? I would really like to take a sample out and find out if it's salt contaminated and if it matches the tea that would have been imported at that time. But he was the librarian of the Historical Society. So as one librarian to another, I have to take him on his word.
Most definitely. A wonderful broadside here that has some interesting commentary.
Yeah, we use this little woodblock engraving of a ship at the top as an emblem throughout our exhibition. It's what it is it looks to us as we read it like a poem, but in fact it's the lyrics of a song. Often at the foot, not on this one, but often on the foot it would say what tune to sing it to. But this is something clearly published soon thereafter, whether that's in 1773, there's only a few weeks left in December of 1773, or early the next year. That's the idea that this has turned into something quite different, that the people, the protesters who acted, they're willing to sacrifice their blood to this cause, that this is more than simply the young men, for the most part, out on a dark winter night, but this is something that has become larger than that in just a matter of weeks or days even.
No, so we get a sense of some of the individuals represented. Going to move on to this item and have you share a little bit about Prince Hall and his role in these times.
Well, Prince Hall, by the time of the Boston Tea Party, is free. We have no likeness of him from his lifetime. Many people, the secretary of the Historical Society who met Prince Hall after the Revolution and used him as a source to describe the events before the Revolution and the history of the end of slavery in Massachusetts, gives a physical description of him. But we thought, rather than use some imaginative idea of what he might have looked like as an image, we would take his signature off of a petition. This is from after the revolution, to the Massachusetts legislature. Here it is, and his name is at the bottom of it. He's writing these petitions going back before the revolution. He's emancipated, is freed from about 1770. So in 1773, he's a person who's only recently gained his freedom, and is about 35 years old at that time, or maybe a little bit older than that. It's very hard to be absolutely certain of the age of enslaved people. They're not really good records kept often, but he's someone that he's a good example of, while the leaders of the Patriot movement are espousing how the royal government is enslaving them, bending them to its will. Here's a person who has lived for more than 30 years enslaved, and has gained his freedom, and he is almost immediately turned around and starts acting on behalf of other enslaved people. So he's a remarkable person. He is important in understanding the history of slavery in Massachusetts, and is one of the few Black people who has the opportunity to speak and be recorded and recollect what that was like. But I'm not speaking for him, but there are other things in his life in 1773 that perhaps are larger than this conflict over the importation of East India tea.
And we're going to move a little quicker pace,
yeah.
just to hear about the Green Dragon Tavern and its significance.
Yes, not deliberately, although the St. Andrew's Lodge of Freemasons here in Boston was very generous and helpful in us mounting this exhibition. But I think it's important to know this idea of fraternal organizations as meeting places and where people could share ideas is really important. And the Green Dragon Tavern was owned by the St. Andrew's Lodge. So it was a meeting place for Freemasons, but it also was an active tavern. This is where the North and West End meet in the northern part of Boston. But it's also really important because it was seen as being the seat of where they had meeting rooms within it, both as a tavern, but they also had meeting rooms where kindred spirits, groups that shared the same political ideas, could meet. Joseph Warren is a Grand Master of this lodge, as is Paul Revere. John Hancock is a member, perhaps not an active member, but by being a member, showing where his political allegiance lay. It's also the case not all Masons are aligned with the Patriot cause. The Grand Master of the kind of oldest lodge in Boston, as someone we'll get to in a moment, John Rowe, and a person who's really interested in Freemasonry but has no opportunity to join one of these traditional lodges is Prince Hall, who I think sees that becoming a member of a fraternal organization is sort of a natural path through society, and is sincerely interested, and sets essentially as a founder of an all-Black lodge in Boston in 1775. And in fact, Black Masons to this day often most use the name Prince Hall in their description of their lodges to show where the origins of Black Masonry is in the United States.
You know, while we won't have time to go into detail, do want to share with viewers very briefly some of the other individuals. So just a very quick word about Phyllis Wheatley.
Phyllis Wheatley she's in the story, but not of it. That is, she is a young Black poet, came to America on a slave ship named the Phyllis, hence her name, was purchased and worked she was a little girl, 7 or 8 years old, but as a household servant by the Wheatley family that lived along King Street, now State Street. But she was extraordinarily precocious, not only learned to read and write, but to write poetry from a very young age. Her poems were published in England in the summer of 1773, and she went there to promote their publication. She arrived back in Boston just weeks before the Boston Tea Party. In fact, copies of her poems, like this one in our collection, were brought to Boston on one of the tea ships, the first to arrive, the Dartmouth. So as I say, she's in the story, but obviously her own concerns are with her return to America, her freedom upon return to America. She was emancipated by the Wheatley family with pressure from her English benefactors, but she's concerned with the circulation of her poems, maybe as the central issue in her young life at that time.
While we've heard a little bit, there's much more to find out about Paul Revere, his wife, Rachel.
Yes. And the only thing I'd say about Paul Revere, just one thing, is we think of Paul Revere's ride, his famous ride in 1775 to alert the countryside. His first ride in a revolutionary cause is, in fact, to bring news of the Boston Tea Party to New York and Philadelphia, so that people in those other urban centers in colonial America would learn this from the viewpoint of the people. He had been active, almost certainly someone who was a participant in the Tea Party itself, but extremely active in this resistance. But that's the first ride is not the ride to Concord and Lexington. It's a ride with the news of the Tea Party.
That was definitely one of the many things I learned from visiting the exhibition. You know, in the less than 2 minutes we have left, just a very brief word. I know we're not going to be doing justice to
no, and I think this will be a wonderful way to encourage people to come and see, so to speak, the rest of the story. This is John Rowe, he owned one of the tea ships, but he had sympathies on both sides. He was moderate in all things, and in 1773 that seemed possible. Within a very short period of time thereafter, the break was so great, there was no middle place, and he's a wonderful example of that.
And it's an example of a diary entry. And in the less than minute left, a quick word about Thomas Hutchinson.
This is extremely poignant because Thomas Hutchinson is born in America. He's the royal governor, but he's born here and has a long public career here. But by the time of the Tea Party, he is seen as essentially, Paul Revere has a cartoon of him as an essentially demonic figure. I mean, he has been put so far beyond what's possible to sustain here that the following spring he leaves to go to England to report on things here and never returns.
Well, again, much more to find out. Fortunately, the exhibition is going to be on view through February of the upcoming year. So lots of time for visitors to make their way to the Massachusetts Historical Society.
And we're here 6 days a week and on into the evening on Tuesdays.
Terrific. Well, Peter, thank you again so much for being here, for informing us about the work that you and your colleagues have done to make this a truly special exhibition commemorating the 250th anniversary of what we now call the Boston Tea Party.
It's my pleasure.
I also want to thank those of you who tuned in for watching, and hope you can join us next time.